Alessandra de Vaca has 35 years of human resources experience in publishing and in healthcare. In her current role as Chief Administrative Officer at Hebrew Senior Life, the largest provider of elder care in the Boston metropolitan area, she not only oversees a large staff internally, but also nearly 75 volunteers. Alessandra, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. So what are the biggest challenges you've noticed in healthcare over your 15-year tenure in the industry?
I would say that the industry has been faced with quite a few challenges and changes. If I were to categorize the biggest 3 or 4, I would say the first is definitely a variety of changes in sort of the regulatory environment. You know, it feels like every day we get a new set of regs that we need to comply with. That coupled with the need for additional transparency about quality of care in the healthcare industry. You know, customers want to know, are they getting the best care possible? And we have to report and publish data about different metrics that we keep track of in healthcare.
And how are you defining your customers? Are these going to be residents?
Patients and residents.
Patients and residents,
right.
Okay.
The other changes I would say that have occurred is, technology has had a huge impact on how care is delivered, the roles that healthcare workers play, the job descriptions that they have. The way we're reimbursed and paid for our services has changed dramatically.
Dramatically, yes, sure.
So that's a big change. And then the other thing I would say is there's a variety of labor challenges and shortages, whether it was the nursing shortage, that we heard about 10 years ago. Now there's no primary care physicians and
Sure.
geriatricians, which are very important to us.
So if you look at this holistically, how much of this has been voluntary change as opposed to change mandated by federal or state legislation?
It's probably a 60-40 split. I mean, obviously
60 on what side?
60 mandated change, 40,
and 40 voluntary.
Right. Technology is not something that was mandated, nor were
Sure.
labor shortages, but certainly the regulatory environment and payment and reimbursement changes were definitely imposed by state or federal governments.
And has technology been a net positive or a net negative for your company?
I would say definitely a net positive, but it requires a lot of change in the workflow of the environment and people getting, like doctors and nurses getting, and even CNAs, et cetera, getting used to using technology. So the initial...
and I assume this is well beyond the electronic medical record. That it's right.
The electronic medical record is a big part of that. That means that doctors have to do their business differently. Their productivity is tracked, the quality of metrics are tracked, things that they were not accustomed to in the past, and that holds true for all of the clinical staff. So I think that getting used to using technology and to then maximize sort of their productivity, and while very importantly keeping the quality of care up, is really a new way of doing things for many people.
It's a completely new dynamic.
Very new.
So I know that you have over 2,000 employees. Mm-hmm. How do you evaluate their success from the executive level all the way down?
Not the same way.
Of course. Really?
Yeah. So we broadly group employees into what we call job families. So,
Okay.
For example, the cooks and housekeepers and engineers and maintenance folks might be one job family, and then there's sort of a senior management team that's another. There's a group of clinicians. So we have different sort of approaches and criteria for the different job families that exist within the organization. Holistically, I would say that there's some technical criteria, and then there's some sort of softer skills that we assess.
So how much of it is qualitative, how much of it is quantitative, or some combination?
I would say at a frontline level, it's more quantitative and some qualitative. Customer service or ability to work as part of a team are definitely qualities that we look for, whether you're a housekeeper or whether you're the CEO.
Right.
But it gets less and less sort of quantitative and harder to pin down quantitatively the more senior you are in the organization.
And what sort of metrics do you use for senior members of the organization?
So for the senior management team, which in our case is about 60 people,
right.
There's sort of 3 components to how we assess our managers and leaders. There's some technical skills that we look for, so everybody has to be able to put, for example, together a budget and have financial management
Right.
skills and read a P&L and those kinds of things. Then there's another bucket that is associated with goals that we've established for the organization. So about 2 to 3 years ago, the organization, the executive leadership team, and eventually the senior leadership team got together and established a set of 5 goals. Then each one of us, based on those 5 goals, has a set of annual or year or 2 goals that we have to achieve as part of our performance and responsibility. So, the marketing person has to make sure that they keep occupancy at a certain level or something like that. So that's one bucket of how we're assessed is, in addition to the technical skill, is how well we did in achieving the particular goals that were set out. These goals, by the way, are reviewed by the CEO and their board on an annual basis. And then there's sort of the third bucket, which is, in my opinion, the hardest to pin down and the softest, which is leadership abilities and skills. So we've done quite a bit of work in the last 2 to 3 years on sort of setting expectations, what Hebrew Senior Life expects for their leaders and from their leaders. So we look in for leaders things like modeling the way, challenging sort of current processes.
And staying as innovative as
you can. Leading from the heart is very important for us. So in the sort of part of our appraisal where we assess those types of criteria, it's a little less, quantitative and more
of the soft
qualitative.
Skills that you were talking to before. You're watching The Language of Business. I'm Greg Stoller, and we're talking with Alessandra de Vaca, a Chief Administrative Officer. She spends a lot of time thinking how to innovate the human resources function. So our first guest, John Murphy, indicated the approach to evaluating talent at a startup is different than what's used at an established company. Where do you come out in this question?
I think there's some overlap and there's some differences.
How so?
So I think qualities of great leaders are the same irregardless of what industry you're in. So, for example, we do a 2-day management development program for all of our managers at the organization. And we talk about 5 leaders. We talk about Nelson Mandela, Bill Belichick, Steve Jobs, and a few other, Mother Teresa.
Right.
and there are some qualities that all of those leaders have, certainly challenging the way that the current processes.
Which are going to go across industries and everything else.
So I think that those things are probably somewhat similar, although the emphasis on how much you need of particular skills may be different in a startup environment than it is in an established organization like ours.
But yet, Hebrew Senior Life, by all accounts, is regarded as an innovative employer. Mm-hmm. This would indicate that some of your new initiatives might feel like intrapreneurship or internal entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. Does this mean you'll be changing the evaluation metrics you'll be using moving forward?
I think that we will for some people or some groups of people for sure, and we've already seen some of that in the last couple of years as we made some pretty significant changes in the organization. So we opened a new campus, by example, a few years ago.
And where was that?
In Dedham.
Yep.
And the way we deliver healthcare on that campus is quite different than how we do it at sort of our flagship in Roslindale. So the way those employees assess some of that criteria has definitely changed. As we try to spurn further growth and change and challenging the processes that we have in place, we definitely, for certain people, put more emphasis on those criteria than others.
So how do you change an established employee base? Because new employees, obviously, by default, aren't going to be jaded by what they might have been experiencing at the organization. How do you take your established employee base and get them to think more entrepreneurially at all levels?
First of all, you have to model the way. So you have to tell people and set the expectation that we want you to challenge the current processes, in a reasonable way.
Of course, right.
So, and you have to appreciate and reward those that do. And I actually think that...
Is that just financially or those through other rewards as well?
I think actually in healthcare we don't have a lot of options to reward financially beyond certain expectations. I think that we need to, it's just saying thank you, it's rewarding people in different ways, whether it's publicly or, giving them some appreciation awards, those kinds of things. But I think even more importantly, you have to not reprimand people who try something new and fail at it. So, because if you do that, the person sitting next to them is never going to try anything new.
They're never going to want to try anything new at all. They're going to say, look what happened to that person. Right.
Right. I think that's one of the most important things you have to do and you have to set the expectation that it's okay to challenge the process. We want you to. And there are people that know how to do that and people that are nervous about that. And I think when we talk about the criteria of what we look for in leaders at Hebrew Senior Life, we don't want the kinds of leaders in particular roles that aren't willing to let their employees sort of, push the boundaries a little bit.
I think it's wonderful that you guys want to treat your employees from both the executive level all the way down to the staff level in that innovative fashion. Thank you. That was great. Not surprisingly, startups and established companies have different approaches to developing and evaluating their management team and overall employee base. But what happens in the trenches themselves? Our next guest is neither a financier nor a management team officer, but rather a serial entrepreneur in the midst of building his latest company. Does he have time to sit down and evaluate talent, or doesn't he have a choice? Matthew Bellows is coming up next on Language of Business.